Welcome back. This is the story of perhaps one of Adelaide's most infamous cases, the family murders. The family is a term used to describe the known pedophile ring that operated in and around the city of Adelaide during the 60s and 70s. Said to include some of Adelaide's senior police and government officials, the family's tentacles reached around the globe. The family came under the spotlight during the brutal and cruel abduction, rape and torture of at least 5 victims that we know of during the 70s and 80s, yet 4 of the murders remain cold cases and only one person charged for the other, Bevan Spencer Von Eniem. During the 70s, Adelaide still lagged behind eastern states in its acceptance of homosexuality. The Vice Squad, a unit charged with drug crimes and homosexuality, often took the law into their own hands. Instead of arresting gay men for their perceived crimes, they would often beat and humiliate them instead. On May 10, 1972, Adelaide University law lecturer Dr. George Duncan and Roger James were attacked and thrown into the Torrens River. Duncan, unable to swim, drowned. The release of the report into the investigation asserts that those responsible for Duncan's death had no real intention of causing anyone's death. This was merely a high-spirited frolic. No one has ever been convicted of the murder. Roger James suffered a broken leg and, in a twist of fate, was pulled from the river by a passer-by and driven to the Royal Adelaide Hospital. That person was Bevan Spencer Von Eniem. The death of George Duncan led to a call for appeals to the state's anti-homosexual laws, leading to South Australia becoming the first Australian state or territory to decriminalise homosexuality in 1975. The new laws saw the creation of gay clubs such as the Mars Bar and others where homosexuals were welcome. It was during this time that these 5 horrific abductions and murders occurred. And this is their story.
At the end of 2017, in a 21-day period, South Australia's judges and magistrates imposed 21 suppression orders. Some of those orders suppressed evidence. Others suppressed the reasons for suppressing that evidence. It's beyond a code of silence. It's a culture of silence.
Nothing exemplifies a culture of silence and secrecy more than one series of horrifically disturbing murders. 5 boys butchered, some cleaned and redressed, and all of them dumped.
A series of unsolved killings by a group of homosexual predators.
A group of respected professional men. Killers who are prominent, even eminent Adelaide citizens.
Growing up in Adelaide in the 1980s, you didn't fear the boogeyman. You feared a white van that was going to come up on the side of the road, pull you in, and then you'd vanish forever.
It shocked Adelaide, a person capable of dismembering another person.
It's a crime spree that's haunted South Australians for 3 decades.
It's a case that is full of as many myths and suppositions as it is truths.
All were drugged and held captive, in one case for up to 5 weeks.
The suggestions, the rumour mill, the innuendo became absolutely rampant.
We seem to draw the unusual, the sick, the deranged killers in Adelaide.
If there's one case that speaks to the very foundation of crime in Adelaide, it's the family.
One of Adelaide's greatest murder mysteries started with the disappearance of 16-year-old Alan Barnes.
He was a joker a lot of the time. He was just a normal kid. Our age difference was only 3 years. We lived in the same room. We'd go to the footy together. All my firsts in life, Alan was there.
On Sunday, June 17, 1979, Alan Barnes was trying to hitch a ride home on Grand Junction Road. From there, he vanished.
During that week that he disappeared, he was gone, out of sight.
That week was the worst in my life. We were searching everywhere.
Alan Barnes' body was discovered a week after his disappearance, and just days before his 17th birthday.
He'd been thrown over the rails of a bridge on Adelaide South Para Reservoir, northeast of Adelaide.
He was held for a week, drugged for control, and died of an injury caused by sexual assault.
A post-mortem showed he died from hemorrhaging and shock, caused by lacerations to the anus, allegedly by a bottle.
Alan had been cleaned and redressed before being dumped at the reservoir. The news of his murder had a devastating impact on the Barnes family.
Mum was screaming and she was smashing her arms against the coffee table that we had. Screaming, no, no, no. I still today cannot get over that scream. It tore my guts out, that realisation, Alan's dead.
The investigation was unable to identify the murderer, leaving the Barnes family without justice. Little more than a month later, a fisherman discovered the body of 25-year-old Neil Muir in the Port Adelaide River.
Neil's body was found floating in 2 garbage bags. Neil had been dismembered.
26-year-old Neil Muir, whose body was found in bags in the Port River, is a victim of a vicious gang.
His body was in a number of pieces. Some of the remains had been scun and they were stuffed inside of his torso.
Neil's head had been severed, but then retied to his body, and some parts, including one of his testicles, were missing. It was one of the most savage murders in South Australian history, yet the autopsy uncovered some chillingly familiar details.
Upon examination by the pathologist, it was discovered he had a significant anal injury. Analysis also revealed the same drugs in Neil Muir's bloodstream that were in Alan's bloodstream.
It appeared that Adelaide had a serial killer on the loose. However, police made the decision to keep the connections between the 2 murders from the public. In the dark about the link, imaginations were left to run wild about the depth of evil lurking in the city. Two years later, another young man disappeared from the city in the dead of night.
Mark Langley was 18, and in February 1982, he didn't come home after a Saturday night out. His body found a week later in the Adelaide Hills. Like Alan Barnes, Mark had been redressed. The circumstances of his death sinister and familiar.
Post-mortem examination revealed the same drugs were found in Mark's bloodstream. He suffered a significant anal injury, almost identical to that of Alan Barnes and Neil Muir.
As well as undeniable similarities, there was something shockingly different about Mark Langley's body.
An incision, approximately 11 centimetres long, had been made in his abdomen. That incision had been sutured together and bandaged. Further examination revealed that a section of his bowel was missing. The pathologist's likely explanation for the incision being made was for an object of some description to be recovered from Mark's rectum.
The horrific wounds revealed something chillingly clinical developing in the killer's methods. And it wouldn't end there. Within 4 months, a farmer would find the remains of 14-year-old Peter Stognev, who had been missing for almost a year.
Stognev has been missing since August the 27th. He's believed to have wagged school and was going to meet friends in the Rundon Wall. That meeting never took place.
The unusual aspect to Peter's remains were that his skeleton had been severed into 3 pieces.
When Peter was examined, the position of the cuts was similar to the position of the cuts in relation to Neil Muir.
And there were more correlations. 2 of the victims had been redressed before they were dumped and had sedatives in their bloodstream. 3 had suffered sexual assault. 3 of the boys had been operated on after their death, and 2 of the victims had been dismembered. But in the course of their investigation, police discovered an even stronger pattern starting to emerge.
Detectives took dozens and dozens of statements from young men at the time, and they told police virtually identical stories of how they were picked up, offered a drink, only to discover they'd been drugged, and when they awoke, they realised they'd been sexually assaulted.
Tonight, for the first time, we're able to bring you a witness who was actually captured. This young man was lucky to survive. What were you saying to them? What did you do?
Oh, leave me alone, please leave me alone. Don't, all that. Then someone else climbed in the bed. Ended up to be a bloke. And they said there's nothing you can do about it.
The survivors' stories confirmed that they were not looking for one serial killer, but a group of them.
They had established that there was a group of homosexual men who commonly picked up male hitchhikers, drugged them and sexually abused them, and then released them.
What happened then?
Thought I was a dead man, to tell the truth. Lost about 3 hours of my whole life. I don't know what happened after that. I just passed out.
John escaped the next morning. He ran for his life.
That was sort of evidence that made our suspicions and theories fit. And I would say every weekend, someone would have been picked up.
Detectives were now on the hunt for a ring of rapists and murderers. At the same time, speculation across the media was tarnishing the memory of the innocent young victims.
The media made the victims the perpetrators, believe it or not. It was to distance themselves, and people wanted to distance themselves from this sort of thing. If we make these kids to be drug addicts or to be homosexuals, oh, it can't happen to my little boy Johnny, because it's their fault that they're in that situation. And the truth about it all is that these poor boys were nothing more than victims of a horrendous crime.
But when the killer struck again, everything changed.
When the next abduction occurred, it would essentially blow the case wide open.
It changed the psyche of South Australia. It changed everything.
The elegant streets of North Adelaide have been inhabited by some of the city's most influential people. On July 5th, 1983, they gained notoriety as a crime scene after the abduction of 15-year-old Richard Kelvin.
Richard was on his way home. He was a couple hundred metres from his house. Residents in the area told police they heard car tyres and they heard raised voices of a number of men, and then silence. Richard was gone. What set Richard's abduction apart was the fact that he was the son of a high-profile South Australian Channel 9 newsreader.
The latest abduction would garner unprecedented publicity across Adelaide.
It changed everybody's thinking. They weren't saying, oh, it's just these rebel kids. Everybody started to go, well, this could happen to my kid now.
The killers weren't picking off working-class boys in the poorer suburbs. They were attacking the heart of the Adelaide establishment. In the intensifying glare of the spotlight, detectives worked furiously to find Richard.
The police launched a campaign with advertising, rewards, virtually anything they could to try and prompt a breakthrough.
The proof that it could happen to anyone put the city on edge. As the public held their breath for news about Richard, investigators zeroed in on their prime suspect. 7 years before Alan Barnes was murdered, in May 1972, 2 gay men were out walking by the River Torrens. In a spot known as the city's #1 beat, it was a popular place for homosexuals to meet. Around 11 p.m, they were viciously attacked and thrown into the river. One man, Dr. George Duncan, drowned, but the other survived with the help from a passerby.
He managed to scramble out of the river, but in the process broke an ankle. He staggered up the bank and was picked up by a chap by the name of Bevan Spencer Von Eniem.
Bevan Spencer Von Eniem was a young gay man who happened to be in the area. He was applauded as a good Samaritan after rushing the victim to hospital. But years later, Von Eniem would come to police attention again, just 2 days after the death of Alan Barnes.
The phone started ringing pretty much straight after Alan's body was found. One of the callers provided information on Bevan Spencer Von Eniem.
It was brought to their attention by a young lad who was in the car with Bevan when they picked up Alan.
But when police finally contacted Von Eniem several weeks later, he denied knowing Alan Barnes. However, he did admit to knowing Neil Muir. This connection was enough to spur detectives into looking into Von Eniem's movements.
He was in the habit of picking up young male hitchhikers, drugging them and sexually abusing them.
Von Eniem been practicing for a long while with his associates, but getting the evidence is always the problem. You can strongly suspect something, but if you haven't got the evidence that you can go into court with, you're in trouble.
Von Eniem had been linked in some way to each of the victims, either through witness statements or his own admissions. But detectives were forced to look beyond the allegations and rumours in order to find a solid connection.
Police had obtained prescriptions for drugs obtained by Von Eniem that were the same drugs discovered in the victims' bodies, which essentially told the detectives that they were in the right direction.
By July 1983, as police were building a case against Von Eniem, the public anxiously waited for news in the search for Richard Kelvin. He had been missing for 7 grueling weeks, when on Sunday, July 24th, his body was discovered in the Adelaide Hills.
The 15-year-old son of Channel 9 newsreader Rob Kelvin was abducted and held captive in a drugged state for 5 weeks before being murdered.
How Richard's parents coped with that knowledge, I think horrific doesn't even come close to it. The community was shocked at the thought of a young lad being held captive for so long.
Richard Kelvin had died from the same injuries sustained by Alan, Neil and Mark. His bloodstream contained the same drugs that had been fed to the other boys, the same drugs that had been prescribed to Von Eniem. This time, however, the investigators found hard evidence linking Von Eniem to the murder of Richard Kelvin.
Forensic officers recovered literally hundreds of fibres from Richard's clothing. Those fibres were conclusively matched to Von Eniem's cardigan, to the carpet in his hallway, and even to the bedspread on Von Eniem's bed. Von Eniem was arrested, denied all knowledge of Richard's murder, and he went to trial.
37-year-old Bevan Spencer Von Eniem is charged with having murdered 15-year-old Richard Kelvin. Von Eniem has pleaded not guilty to the charge.
In the mid-stages of the trials, when he was confronted with the mountain of forensic evidence, he changed his mind and offered to give a further statement.
During the committal hearing, Von Eniem made a remarkable turnaround in his story. He told police he'd met Kelvin on the day he disappeared, and that Kelvin had voluntarily got into his car and later gone to Von Eniem's home. Von Eniem claims he later dropped Kelvin back in town and gave him $20 for a taxi fare.
It was essentially the nail in his coffin.
Bevan Spencer Von Eniem was found guilty and sentenced to 36 years without parole.
Von Eniem is one of the worst sex offenders that Australia will ever encounter.
With the savage murders of 4 boys still unaccounted for, the public's obsession with the case refused to wane.
So then it started all the rumours.
A gang was involved, a group of respected professional men, killers who are still free.
We call them the old school Thai gang.
The innuendo was that they were untouchable.
In Adelaide, South Australia in 1984, after a string of brutal murders, sex predator Bevan Spencer Von Eniem was sentenced to life for the murder of 15-year-old Richard Kelvin. Despite the conviction, the media's fascination with the murders refused to go away.
At that stage, there was speculation that the cases were linked, but police had not made any public statement.
In 1988, a coronial inquest finally declared that they believed Bevan Spencer Von Eniem had not acted alone, and that the killing of 5 young men was the work of a group of sexual predators.
So then it started all the rumours, and things just got worse and worse.
Then in September 1988, a primetime national news program gave the case a name.
It's one of South Australia's longest-running murder cases. For years there have been rumours that a gang was involved, a well-organised ring of homosexuals known as the Family.
It stuck almost immediately. Pretty much the first time that this term was used to describe the group, it became synonymous with the case.
Speculation about the members of the group became absolutely rampant.
A group of respected professional men, killers who are still free. Many of them prominent, even eminent Adelaide citizens.
They were said to be high-profile politicians, lawyers, doctors. The idea was that these were people that Adelaideans would know, that they'd be shocked if they knew who was responsible.
We call them the old school Thai gang.
How high up are we talking?
About as high as you can get.
The innuendo was that they were untouchable.
The sordid rumours about those responsible went beyond the case and created a commentary on the city itself.
This case really taps into this belief of a two-tier system in Adelaide, of the higher-ups and everyone else.
There definitely is a class system in South Australia that is very, very prevalent.
While the class divide may have fueled the rumours, Nigel Hunt believes that they have no basis in fact.
The suggestion that judges, politicians and high-profile businessmen were involved was simply just not true.
So how did the atmosphere of secrecy create this corrosive culture of suspicion?
Police were hamstrung in exactly how much they could tell the public. They weren't in a position to outline the identities of their suspects.
Over the years, the police have dispelled the rumours about eminent South Australians, and to this day, the names of their actual suspects have not been revealed.
Police have 4 suspects. Von Eniem, obviously. The second suspect is an eastern suburbs businessman who's now in his 70s. The third suspect is a doctor who lives and practices in Sydney. Fourth suspect now lives in Brisbane, driving buses. He was a male prostitute when he was in Adelaide. He is suspected of being in the car that abducted Richard.
While the monsters that committed these killings remain free, those who have lost their loved ones fight to keep their memories alive.
I believe that anybody who you carry in your heart is always alive. They can only take the physical part. So Alan is still alive in my heart, yes.
As observers, we can only wonder whether this lack of resolution could be one of the sparks that gave life to the Adelaide murder myth.
These are only 5 of the victims that we know of. Many more may never have been linked to the case. The parents of these young boys have begun to pass away, never knowing justice for their sons. In a further twist to the story, in 2015, Alan Barnes' brother, Ross Barnes, by then aged 57, took his dog, a black and white border collie cross called Tammy, for a walk and has never returned. While Von Eniem served time in Adelaide's Yatala prison, rumours began to emerge of his special treatment on the inside. It was later revealed that many prison officers were purchasing Von Enem's artwork on greeting cards, breaking rules that prisoners should not profit while incarcerated. One female officer, known only as Mary, admitted to befriending Von Eniem during her shifts at the prison. She would bring him gifts of paper and watercolours for his art, and would even include Von Eniem in a breakfast of bacon and eggs that she would cook up for staff working the Sunday morning shift. Mary also admits to bringing in a woman's smock for Von Eniem to wear. She no longer works for the prison system, but continues to visit Von Eniem and accept phone calls from him to this day. Today he serves time in the Port Augusta prison, only 50 minutes away from where I live. Although eligible, Von Eniem has not applied for parole. A further 3-month sentence was imposed when written child pornography stories were found in his cell. Bob O'Brien has written the book Youngblood about the case, and we are giving away a copy of the book as a thank you to our channel supporters. To be in the draw, simply subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below this video. The draw will take place on a live on April 5th at 7 p.m. Australian Central Time. Thank you for watching.